Welcome to Brain Ponderings. I'm the host, Mark Matson. In this episode, I'm going to talk about something I've been interested in for a long time. That is how chemicals that are produced by plants and fungi affect the brain and affect general health as well. Now, this is going to be a presentation, or is a presentation, with slides. So I'm showing slides to illustrate what I'm talking about. So if you want to go on my YouTube channel, to watch, that would be good. Otherwise, you can listen on the audio and hopefully I'll explain things in a way you can visualize in your mind's eye. All right, so it turns out that plants and fungi produce a bewildering number of chemicals whose function in the plant are generally not well understood. These are called secondary metabolites because they're not involved in any bioenergetic process, for example. And most of these chemicals that I'm going to talk about seem to function in defending the plants and fungi against predators, if you will, insects, uh, herbivores, omnivores such as us. And interestingly, these chemicals are often in the vulnerable region or parts, that is, of the plants and fungi, that is, the parts that are critical for their ultimate reproduction. Okay, this first slide, I'm showing an illustration of a non-human primate in the arboreal canopy, and it's picking over some fruit and presumably selecting the ripe fruit to eat because the ripe fruit has a higher energy content. But I'll talk about how these kinds of fruits and vegetables um, have chemicals that are good for our general health and brain health. Now, before I get to that, I'm going to quickly remind you that we're all aging. In fact, our brain performance declines beginning at about 30 years of age. That's similar to athletic performance, right? I mean, we all know that for most any sport that involves, you know, very quick, accurate functioning, decline begins in 30. So most professional athletes don't go much beyond 30, 35 unless they, by the way, eat a plant-based diet, such as Tom Brady, for example, the best quarterback in American football in history, and would play till the age of 40, beyond 40. Okay, so our memory declines, our so-called executive function, our ability to do task switching declines, and often very late in life, for example, 70s, 80s, there's a kind of an accelerated decline. Now, the known risk factors for accelerated brain aging and brain disorders associated with aging, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke, those risk factors include obesity, insulin resistance, and diabetes, high blood pressure, a high, if you will, bad cholesterol carrying lipoprotein, um, some genetic factors too. In the case of hyperlipidemia, some individuals have genetic variants in, for example, LDL receptor, which removes cholesterol from the blood and gets it into cells where it's used. Sedentary lifestyle, so lack of exercise, uh, concussions are not good for your brain in terms of its trajectory during aging. Chronic psychosocial stress, so kind of chronic hyperactivation of the sympathetic and uh, hypothalamic adrenal neuroendocrine system, poor diet composition, which I'll talk about, and that includes lack of a lot of plants, so high meat, high sugar, fructose, saturated fat diets are not good for your brain as you age. There's increasing evidence that environmental pollution, for example, air pollution, not good for the brain. Viral infections, we know about long COVID, for example, and its effects on the brain. I've had a podcast on that a long time ago. Okay, and then conversely, how do you kind of slow the decline of aging and reduce the risk for these disorders? Regular physical exercise, dietary energy restriction, intermittent fasting, things I've had guests and talk with me about in previous podcasts and brain ponderings. Keeping your mind intellectually challenged like we're doing now, that exercises your neurons, and just like exercising your muscles in a good way is good for their long-term health, so is true with the brain. And then what I'm going to talk about today, healthy diet composition, and particularly chemicals in plants and fungi. All right, so I had a podcast where I gave essentially a lecture on brain aging and talked about the different, I guess you'd say, bad things that are occurring in brain cells, neurons during aging, accumulation of oxidatively damaged DNA, proteins, membrane components, impaired energy production, mitochondrial dysfunction, impaired ability to remove damaged and dysfunctional molecules and organelles, such as mitochondria, impaired ability to repair damage. There's an elegant DNA repair system in cells that normally repairs any damage to the DNA, but that's compromised during aging, including in the brain. I had Will Bohr as a guest talking about that. Something my lab worked on a lot, aberrant neural network hyperexcitability, problems in controlling neural excitability, and that's associated with problems in neurons being able to handle calcium. Normally, when a neuron fires, the calcium moves into the cell and then is rapidly removed. But with aging and in neurodegenerative disorders, the calcium is not removed effectively and it can be toxic to the cells. And then impaired adaptive stress response signaling. So it turns out that I think an increasing number of other scientists think that one of the main ways that chemicals in plants and fungi benefit cells, organ systems, including the brain, is by imposing a mild stress response in the cells, and the cells respond adaptively by enhancing their ability to cope with further stress and resist disease. So this is something variously called adaptive stress responses, hormesis, or preconditioning. And I'll talk about the two key things here are the intensity of the stress, in this case, phytochemicals or mycochemicals, the duration of exposure of the cells, uh, and yeah, those are kind of the two main things. So that the transient exposure is kind of similar to intermittent exercise or intermittent fasting. Intermittent exposure to phytochemicals or mycochemicals seem to do good things for the brain because the cells respond in an adaptive way. Also, with aging, there's brain inflammation. I had podcasts on that, and stem cell exhaustion. And we've also had podcasts on neural stem cells, as well as cell senescence. I'll briefly mention that. I had Darren Baker from the Mayo Clinic talking about cell senescence and its role in aging in general and brain aging. Okay. Uh, so the typical American diet, or at least for many Americans who don't eat healthy diets, is fast food. So high calorie density, high in simple sugars, including fructose, high in saturated fats, fried food, and very few vegetables and fruits. All right, so there's a lot of different plants that we can eat. In fact, probably thousands of them. Typically, at the supermarket, you'll only find maybe 50 the most, but there are others. And the effects on the health have been studied in a number of different ways. One is by epidemiological studies, simply asking the question, what do people eat and how is that related to their health? Another way is actually randomized controlled trials, for example, where you compare a plant-based diet to a fast food diet and have a control diet, I guess, with more mixed composition. Uh, then another way is to, in animal studies, you can do a lot more, of course. And so we expose animals to individual chemicals known to be produced by specific plants and then see how that affects whatever we're looking at, learning and memory, vulnerability in animal models of stroke or neurodegenerative disorders, etc. And we try to elucidate any underlying mechanisms, what's going on in the cells that explain any effects we see of these chemicals. Okay, there's a number of fairly recent good review articles on diet composition and general health and brain health. And the conclusions of these studies, and I'll talk briefly about one in particular, are that plant-based diets are very healthy. So I already mentioned this before. So it's good to have a high intake of vegetables, especially colorful green leafy vegetables, fruits, whole fruits, whole grains are good for health, uh, oatmeal, whole wheat, etc. Nuts, seeds like almonds, walnuts, sunflower seeds, beans, fish with omega-3 fatty acids is better than meats such as cow or pig with high saturated fat and low omega-3. Uh, Olive oil and other oils with good quality fats. And then on the other hand, it's good to have low intake of ultra processed foods, refined. So white bread essentially is not so good as whole wheat bread. Red meats, particularly processed red meats. Sugars, high sodium is not good, particularly your cardiovascular system, maybe kidneys. Uh, Trans fats have supposedly been banned, and they were really bad. So excessively hydrogenated vegetable oil, for example. Okay. And then, diet and in combination with other lifestyle factors like exercise, moderation in calorie intake, intermittent fasting, and then keeping socially and intellectually challenged. So here's a very recent study, really interesting study with a lot of statistical power and a really good design that came out just this week, a couple days ago in Nature Medicine. And in this article, they followed over 100,000 men and women over a 30-year period, documenting what they ate, their diet composition, that is, and their health status. And so I divided this up. So what's shown here is in darker green is better outcome. Red, increasingly red, is poor health outcomes. So at the top here in these columns, you can see healthy aging. They had like an index for aging, cognitive function, how well is the brain's working, learning and memory, physical function, mental health. So things like uh, lack of anxiety or depression, um, free from chronic disease, so that is lack of diabetes, hypertension, uh, obesity, etc., and then survival past the age or to the age of 70. And they publish this now, and I think they're still following these people. So maybe they'll in another decade or two they'll follow up on what's happening. But the data is really striking. So this is a list of the things that in green are really good for health. So fruits, whole grains or vegetables, uh, monounsaturated fatty acids, uh, so relatively high to mono to saturated fatty acids, uh, high in unsaturated fat, leafy green vegetables, nuts, things I mentioned, vegetables, berries, yogurt, low fat, dairy, olive oil, um, omega-3 fatty acids, beans, tomatoes, coffee, and tea. Uh, and I'm going to talk about chemicals. I'll select some chemicals in these. I mean, coffee and tea, obviously, caffeine's one that everybody knows about, and it's the reason it's in the coffee and tea plants is it acts as a natural pesticide that keeps bugs from eating the beans in the plant. Uh, Wine is kind of neutral. So this gray area at the bottom here, these are things that didn't really have a major effect. And that includes coffee and tea, so seem to be not bad or not good. Fish and seafood, interestingly, had a kind of a neutral effect. So a plant-based diet was kind of the main thing. And then on the bad side, if we go to the bottom to see the worst thing, the trans fats, total meat intake, sodium, red and processed meats, butter and margarine, unprocessed red meat, added saturated fats and trans fats. So, a lot of the fast foods have most of these things in them. French fries, uh, low energy beverages, liquor, sugar sweetened beverages, starchy vegetables. So I guess potatoes, it's what they're saying there is, I guess don't eat too much potatoes. Um, and by the way, in this study, they controlled for potential confounding factors such as smoking, uh, alcoholism, so excessive alcohol intake, and a number of other things which you can find in the. So, in other words, they ruled out other potential lifestyle factors that could be determining outcomes are beneficial. For example, maybe someone who smokes a lot, um, maybe all the people that smoke eat a lot of meat or something, but they kind of are controlled for that. Um, right. Pizza, animal fat. Beer is kind of marginally not good, not a major adverse effect. Okay, and then most of you have probably heard about the blue zones, and this was actually from a study done, this study here that actually started with, published more than 20 years ago, where scientists studied a group, they actually studied multiple areas in uh, Sardinia, Italy, and they found in one area in particular that the individuals lived longer, and they documented pretty rigorously the actual age of the people based on their birth certificates and other records. So it was very well done. They didn't identify any potential mechanism. Interestingly, though, that the people with this high level of longevity did live in fairly mountainous region. So maybe, exercise is a factor. They have to go up and down the hills. And these are all pretty much, it's kind of a farming area. All right, and then Dan Buettner, who was then working with National Geographic, he went there, he went to Okinawa, Japan, and then he had identified several other areas, Icaria, Greece, Loma Linda, California, and then later Nicoya, Costa Rica, where the people have exceptional longevity. That is, a lot more people than other places in the world live to be 100 years old or live to be in their 80s, even 90s, functioning well, both physically and cognitively. Now, from the standpoint of their diet, in all cases of these so-called blue zones, with exceptional longevity, so slow aging, if you will, successful aging, plant-based diets, approximately 80% or more of the calories came from complex carbohydrates and nuts, whole grains, and other vegetables, and so low meat content. Okay, so what's in the plants that might be benefiting health? There's a lot of chemicals in plants. This diagram, I know you won't be able to read this, but this is one class of chemicals that seem to be particularly important in health benefits of plant-based diets, and these are called the polyphenols. They have these uh, multiple rings, phenolic rings. And in this review article, which came out in actually the Aging Research Reviews, which is a journal that I started, I was a founding editor back in 2002, and then when I retired from the NIH a few years ago, it's been 5 years, almost 6 years, I turned it over, the journal, to another scientist who's been doing a really good job. But in this article, they talk about specific polyphenols and their what's been shown in terms of their effects on cells, in terms of some of the hallmarks of aging that I talked about. And so these chemicals seem to reduce oxidative damage to cells, enhance repair of damage. Some seem to stimulate autophagy, uh, bolster mitochondrial health. And in neurons, some of these chemicals I'd talk about can protect the neurons against, for example, hyperexcitability, against being damaged by the amyloid protein, which accumulates in the brain in Alzheimer's disease, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, if you want any of these articles that I'm citing in these slides, usually down at the lower right, I'd be happy to send them to you. If you go on PubMed, you should be able to find them and download them. In some cases, depending on the journal and I guess the authors, uh, you may or may not be able to download the PDF. So if you can't get a PDF, I'm happy to send it to you. You can find my email at my Johns Hopkins website. Just Google it. Okay, and here's just some examples of just a few of chemicals that have been isolated from some of the plants that are consumed in the blue zones. Some of these you may know about, for example, curcumin in the Indian spice and turmeric root. Okay, there's a lot of research on this, and I'm not going to be able to go through individually like a whole bunch of different chemicals and their effects on, say, cultured neurons or mouse brain. There's huge literature on this. If you want to search for specific chemicals, do that on PubMed. Just plug in the chemical, maybe put in, for example, curcumin brain or uh, sulforaphane neurons or whatever you want, sulforaphane, Alzheimer's. But I should say though, before I get into this, that most of the vast majority of studies that have been done so far are still in either cultured cells or laboratory rodents. There's less done with looking at effects of individual phytochemicals or mycochemicals, except in the case of psychedelics, in humans in randomized controlled trials. Why is that? It has to do with money or lack of money, because these these chemicals cannot be patented by drug companies. And so for most clinical trials, there's money comes from drug companies that have a patent protection. So they're willing to pay for clinical trials, which hopefully are done in an unbiased way by people not associated with the drug company. Um, but anyway, so that's one thing about these naturally occurring chemicals. So what drug companies often do is they'll take curcumin, for example, or sulforaphane, and then modify the molecule and try to see if it has as a good effect as the initial molecule, and then they can maybe patent that as kind of because they're doing chemistry and kind of engineering the molecule and changing it. Okay, so nearly 20 years ago, me and A. Wu Cheng, who was a postdoc in my lab then, and then went on to be a more senior scientist at National Institute on Aging, um, published this. So back then, there was this idea that if you swamp the brain with chemicals that scavenge free radicals that are directly antioxidant in the sense that they actually sop up the free radicals. A good example of that is vitamin E. So the idea was there was evidence that oxidative stress is playing a role in Alzheimer's disease. And so if we can just sop up the free radicals, we'll have a beneficial effect. And then experiments were done in cell culture with some positive effects, but not really dramatic, for example, in protecting against amyloid beta peptide toxicity. But then clinical trials were done in patients with Alzheimer's, no effect of these direct antioxidants. However, um, back then I was thinking to myself, so there's not much on what the heck's the function of all these other chemicals in plants that aren't just sopping up free radicals. In fact, there aren't that many chemicals that just like vitamin E. And so there's hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of chemicals produced by the plants. They're often concentrated in the vital parts of the plant, like the skin of a fruit. For example, apples have quercetin in the skin, or or sprouts, right? And these chemicals that we knew about that seemed back then there was some evidence, for example, that sulforaphane had beneficial effects on health. Um, and those kinds of chemicals, they have a very bitter taste. They're kind of noxious. And I found this book. It was a very thick, like 1,000 pages, and it was called Insect Antifeedants. And each page was a chemical that had been isolated from a plant and shown to have a noxious effect on insects. So the insects essentially wouldn't uh, eat anything that the chemical was put on, or they'd essentially move away from the chemical when they tasted it. So I had the idea that maybe the chemicals in the plants that are good for our health, they function as natural pesticides, and that in us, during evolution, and I'll briefly talk about this, it was to the advantage of insects and herbivores to be able to consume plants because they're a source of energy and other nutrients. And so we co-evolved over periods of millions of years with plants. And and I'll talk about the adaptations we have to being able to limit any potential toxic effects of these phytochemicals or mycochemicals and take advantage of potential beneficial effects. So the idea is these phytochemicals induce cellular stress response, and we showed this with some of these chemicals in neurons, upregulation of antioxidant enzymes, in some cases even upregulation of protein chaperones such as heat shock proteins, proteins that protect neurons against damage, um, neurotrophic factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is very important for learning and memory and stress resistance, et cetera. So this is kind of the simple hypothesis in this article we published in Trends in Neurosciences. Okay, then, we did some more and published some original research articles and so on, and some more elaborate review articles where we focused on mechanisms. And then I got invited to write an article for Scientific American. It was called What Doesn't Kill You. And essentially, the point here is that, and I'll just read this. Plants don't have the option of fleeing predators. As a consequence, they've developed an elaborate set of chemical defenses to ward off insects and other creatures that want to make them a meal. Toxic chemicals that the plants use against these predators are consumed by us at low levels in fruits and vegetables. Exposure to these substances causes a mild stress reaction that lends resilience to our cells and bodies. And just in kind of a general step back 30,000 foot view, this is like exercise and fasting, a mild stress or challenge on the cells, and they respond in good ways as long as it's transient and not too severe. Okay, so, and this may account for the increasing evidence for beneficial effects of eating these plants. And in this article, we just briefly talked about a few chemicals, caffeine. It's a very bitter tasting chemical. Um, Insects don't like caffeine. They won't eat your tea leaves if you leave, or coffee grounds if you leave them on the table, but they'll go right to your donut. Capsaicin, obviously, in hot peppers is very noxious, right? You don't want to eat too much of them unless you get paid thousands of dollars to do it. Uh, Catechins, epicatechins, and I'll briefly talk about that. Turns out dark chocolate, 100% cacao, has a bitter tasting epicatechins that seem to do good things for neurons. Sulforaphane I mentioned, curcumin I mentioned, resveratrol I didn't mention. So these are some of the adaptive stress response pathways known to be activated. I'll go into a little more detail on this in a minute, but they involve transcription factors, or they involve certain enzymes in the sirtuin class, which I've talked about. Actually, I talked about sirtuin 3, but sirtuin 1 is another important enzyme that responds to some of these phytochemicals. And so these effects can induce adaptive stress responses we think can and have shown in many cases upregulate neurotrophic factor levels, promote formation of new synapses, and stress resistance. Okay, so here's caffeine and its structure. Here's sulforaphane. Sulforaphane actually isn't a polyphenol, as you can see. It doesn't have the ring structure. Um, what it does have is these two sulfur atoms, which seem to be important. And I'll briefly talk about how this sulforaphane molecule interacts with a protein complex called the KEAP NRF2 complex, and it's actually NRF2 is a transcription factor. So this chemical can activate a transcription factor that stimulates genes that encode several important antioxidant enzymes, hemoxygenase and a quinone reductase uh, as well. Tomatidine, something we studied in one paper, it's shown here, but it's been studied some more. It's really interesting. This chemical is present in high amounts in green tomatoes, but not so much in ripe tomatoes. There's more than a tenfold decline, a dramatic decline as these tomatoes ripen in the amount of this chemical. So as you know, insects tend to stay away from the green tomatoes, but they will eat the ripe tomatoes. Now, the seeds, if you were to take the seeds, say the immature seeds forming in these green tomatoes and plant them, they won't grow because they're not mature. Whereas if you take the seeds from these ripe tomatoes, they grow. So this is a way that the tomato plant evolved to prevent, say, animals from consuming the green tomatoes and waiting till the seeds are ripe. And oftentimes the insects, well, not oftentimes, they eat the meaty part of in this case, ripe tomato or any ripe fruit, and leave the seeds. And the seeds actually have their own chemicals that protect them. And yeah. Okay, so this is the idea with evolution that over time we evolved ways of being able to tolerate noxious chemicals at some level. And this previous slide actually shows this. So probably eating a lot of green tomatoes may make you sick. I've eaten maybe one or two, but not more. So here's the evolutionary adaptations we know for preventing overdosing on potentially toxic chemicals in plants. They have bitter taste, all of them, all the ones that seem to be good for health and brain health. If we eat too much of them, we vomit. Another thing is that these chemicals, animals evolved enzymes that rapidly degrade these phytochemicals and then we pee them out, the metabolites out. And these are called the liver detoxification enzymes or P450 enzymes. And so when we eat, say we're to eat a green tomato or some broccoli sprouts that have high sulforaphane, um, so we eat them, they get in our system, but that when they go through the liver, they're detoxified. So they're only in our system a short time period. So these natural pesticides that we consume are removed quickly. That contrasts with man-made pesticides, which we didn't evolve with, and we don't have enzymes to degrade them, and they accumulate. DDT is a good example. And then adaptive cellular stress responses, and this seems to be key for the health benefits of these phytochemicals. And I'll talk about some of this. And again, we've published extensively on this over the years. I'm happy to send you any of those articles. Okay, so here's just one example. So I mentioned sulforaphane and curcumin. So in the cytoplasm, so this is a cell schematic view. This is the outer membrane of the cell. Okay, so this is the so-called cytoplasm inside the cell, and this is the nucleus down here in the lower right. There's two proteins that are important in response to sulforaphane and curcumin. NRF2, nuclear regulatory factor 2, and KEAP1. Now, normally, that is in the absence of sulforaphane and curcumin or other signals. For example, reactive oxygen species, free radical, um, because this is responsive to free radicals as well. NRF2 is bound to KEAP1 and it stays outside the nucleus. Then, when the sulforaphane interacts, NRF2 is released from KEAP1. It goes to the nucleus and induces expression of genes. I mentioned antioxidant enzymes, but also, like in the liver, the phase 2, the detoxification enzymes are upregulated. So then these genes are transcribed and the antioxidant enzymes or phase 2 detoxification proteins are produced and protect the cell against continuing or even other kinds of stress. We actually think this mechanism protects cells against obviously oxidative stress, but also metabolic stress, such might occur in a stroke, or proteopathic stress, such as accumulation of damaged proteins, etc. I also have some other um, chemicals here. For example, the capsaicin in the hot peppers or allicin in garlic. Or even THC, they activate calcium channels and induce a mild adaptive stress response, activating a transcription factor called CREB, which upregulates brain-derived neurotrophic factor as well as antioxidant enzymes and cell resilience proteins, if you will. Okay, the catechins, which I mentioned, for example, in dark chocolate or green tea, they can also kind of more indirectly stimulate NRF2. Okay, resveratrol, quercetin, they seem to have multiple mechanisms of action. One that's been studied quite a bit is effect on this enzyme SIRT1, which is a protein deacetylase that can upregulate stress resistance proteins. And yeah, so there's multiple ways in which these chemicals can bolster cellular stress resistance. So I mentioned cell senescence. Quercetin is commonly used now. It's been used in many, many published studies in mice. And there's even some studies going on in humans to look at its ability to remove senescent cells. So in my podcast with Darren Baker at the Mayo Clinic, he described what happens during cell senescence. So say you have normal cells in the brain, stem cells or astrocytes, in your skin cells, your skin cells or your gut. So in these brain regions or other tissues, there's stem cells that can divide. There are other cells that can divide. And normally there's a turnover of these cells. So there's a pool of stem cells. They can divide asymmetrically. So you have one daughter cell continues to divide. The other daughter cell differentiates into whatever, a skin cell or a cardiac cell or a brain cell, depending on where it is. And then those uh, differentiated cells, at least in a lot of tissues, except in the case of neurons, uh, normally die. They serve their function for some time period, and then they die by a process called apoptosis that selectively removes the dead cell without adversely affecting any cells around it. With cell senescence, the the cells stop dividing and they aren't removed like they normally would be. And they get big, physically bigger, and they start spitting out a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF, as well as actual certain reactive oxygen species, for example, um, hydrogen peroxide. And these cause local stress and inflammation. And it's been shown that quercetin can selectively kill senescent cells without adversely affecting the normal cells. So quercetin is present in high levels in the skin of apples. Apple a day keeps the doctor away. Onions, blueberries, blackberries shown here. Um, there have been a number of studies. The brain, Dr. Baker talked about his early study, Peisu Zhang, uh, uh, before I retired from NII, she did a very nice study. It took a number of years and had evidence that uh, one, there are cells that undergo senescence in the brain in Alzheimer's disease patients and in mouse model Alzheimer's disease where there's a lot of amyloid and tau pathology. And then importantly, when she removed these senescent cells with quercetin plus another chemical I'll talk about, it's actually a drug, um, that ameliorated the cognitive deficits and some of the pathology in the Alzheimer's mice. And then in this uh, subsequent study by Mayo Clinic people, um, removing senescent cells throughout the body, either through genetic means or quercetin plus dasatinib, uh, had beneficial effects on cognition, uh, on age-related cognitive impairment. So they looked at really old mice, 2 years old, which is old for a mice, and showed that in these old mice whose cognitive function starts to decline, removing senescent cells can prevent that, actually reverse that decline. Okay, quickly, here's just some data from Peisu Zhang's paper. And essentially, she showed in tissue from Alzheimer's patients and the Alzheimer's mice that there are senescent cells accumulating. Uh, in these studies, our studies, Peisu evidence suggests that these senescent cells are derived from oligodendrocyte progenitor cell, the stem cell that's throughout the brain that normally it gives rise to the myelinating cells. But in Alzheimer's and in the mouse model, these oligodendrocyte progenitor cells undergo senescence and cause inflammation, cognitive impairment. But in test of learning and memory, she showed that the quercetin plus dasatinib uh, lessened the cognitive deficits in this water maze test. So you can read about that if you want to look at the article. And then in the other article I mentioned, they let the animals get to be 2 years old, and then they treated for 2 months with quercetin plus dasatinib, and then they tested them in the maze, and the compared to untreated animals that didn't get the Q plus D, quercetin plus dasatinib, their memory was much better, and they showed that it removes the senescent cells. Okay, blueberries. Um, when I started out at NIA, there was actually, he was there at the time, Jim Joseph, the last author on this first paper listed here. And he's done a lot of work with Don Ingram and others on aging in general and brain aging in particular. And they found that if they feed rats blueberries over a long period of time, it can improve their memory. And he also had evidence that it lessens inflammation. And then there's multiple subsequent studies confirming and extending those findings. And I think I put it in here. There's a recent study in humans that suggests there may be some beneficial effects. Now, it's not completely known which chemical or chemicals in the blueberries are responsible for this. It could be um, chlorogenic acid or these procyanidins or anthocyanins. It's not completely clear, and it could be a mixture, which is another thing. Um, I personally don't recommend taking supplements of a lot of these chemicals because why not just eat the fruits and vegetables themselves? And they have mixtures of chemicals that are likely playing a role in combinations. And in fact, we evolved. We didn't evolve by buying sulforaphane tablets and then eating them every day. We evolved eating multiple of these chemicals in the plants. Okay, another example, dark chocolate. It's a cacao beans in the upper left that's split in half. You can see the chocolatey looking stuff in the middle. That's 100% cacao. And there has been some work suggesting that these epicatechins and epigallocatechins uh, may play a role in some of the benefits of the dark chocolate. Dark chocolate. If you if you haven't ever eaten 100% cacao chocolate, try it sometime. Very bitter tasting. In fact, for me, if I eat too much of it, I get a lot of heartburn. Um, so it's probably better to eat it with a meal than just by itself. But anyway, there's this study was from Henriette von Prague at the NIA where I was, and she found that this epicatechin uh, stimulates BDNF production in mice and have some interesting effects on neurotransmitters as well that have been associated with uh, reducing anxiety and depression. So that serotonin, norepinephrine. So that was interesting. So anyway, this is kind of interesting that chocolate, epicatechin seems to reduce anxiety levels. Uh, right. And then there's been some other studies. This Brickman et al. Had a couple of studies in humans. One in older adults that uh, essentially people who are eating unhealthy diets, and they found that in these older people who are eating unhealthy diet, uh, consumption of dark chocolate, cacao, over a period of several, actually 3 years, resulted in improvement in performance on a memory, or it's actually a processing speed task. So the brain worked more quickly, efficiently in solving the problems in those tasks. And then in another paper, which I think it's kind of an addition to the first study, they did some structural magnetic resonance imaging, finding that over a period of these 3 years, there was an increase in the size of a part of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus, which is very important for learning and memory. Okay, what about mushrooms? So I mentioned at the beginning, I'd talk a little bit about fungi as well. Uh, there's a huge literature. I'm not an expert on all the chemicals that different species of fungi produce. I'll briefly talk about psychedelics, but there's a lot of work done on other mushrooms and potential health benefits through chemicals produced by these mushrooms. So this is one book here, and I'm not advocating any book. I don't have this book. I have some books on mushrooms, but I have done some foraging for mushrooms, and I can identify there are mushrooms that can kill you, uh, many that can make you sick, but not kill you. So you got to know what you're doing. I know like four species of mushrooms that I'm 100% sure I can identify. And so I've in the past foraged those and eaten those. On the right here, this is just the collection of mushrooms that let's see who's with me. Myself, my son, and his wife, I think. Yeah, we were up on a vacation in Maine. It had rained a lot before we got up there. And we went on a trail, and within 1 hour, or maybe hour and a half, we found all these different species of mushrooms on the trail. Uh, and there's only one species that we were confident in identifying, and that was this black trumpet mushroom, which is kind of like the uh, anyway, we knew we were 100% sure, and we actually did eat those and threw the other ones away. Okay, so here's a review article on some of the phytochemicals in mushrooms. This is fairly recent, a couple of years ago. Uh, and so these are some of the species that have been studied. Now, some of these are toxic, most notably the mannatum mushrooms. These are toxic and can kill you if you eat too much of it. This is chanterelles. They actually, except for the color, look almost identical to the black trumpet mushrooms. So these are edible. I know that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So it turns out some mushrooms have quercetin, but here's some of the other molecules in mushrooms. Some are known to be, as I mentioned, toxic, including neurotoxic. For example, ibotenic acid is a very potent cytotoxin. It binds to glutamate receptors and excites neurons to death. So if you were to eat a mushroom with a ibotenic acid, you may get epileptic seizures and die. Muscarine, this activates certain type of acetylcholine receptors. Um, so it's interesting that some of these chemicals act on neurotransmitter receptors, right? And that was actually, I think, known, at least in like these toxins case, known before the psychedelics were studied, and it was shown that the psychedelics act on a certain type of serotonin receptor. Okay, this was an interesting paper. I looked up quickly on the evolution of mushrooms and chemicals in mushrooms. And so, as you know, psilocybin is and psilocin are the ones in the magic mushrooms, the psilocybes genus, that has very reliable, fairly reliable hallucinogenic effects. And it's very interesting because it's very non-toxic in terms of killing. You cannot overdose on psilocybin, and but nevertheless, it causes this dramatic behavioral change. So one can imagine that during evolution, if a human or a deer or whatever animal, who knows, maybe even an insect, uh, ate, start eating these mushrooms, they would have hallucinations, and probably you're not going to eat much more when you're hallucinating. So anyway, there's a very interesting study on the evolution of different species of mushrooms, including the psilocybe. And this may be true for plants too, that like the peyote cactus, where the uh, where mescaline is produced, psychoactive drug there, or DMT in the South American, the Amazon plants that produce this hallucinogen. Okay, psychedelic. Yeah, and this was really interesting. They looked at kind of the time course of evolution of the mushrooms versus different types of animals, insects, mollusks, and then mammals and primates. Okay, now uh, this is huge. Everybody's heard about psychedelics, and there's a lot of clinical trials ongoing. It's pretty clear in my mind from the results so far that psychedelics, when they're taken in the right setting and you don't have a bad trip, uh, uh, which is the way the randomized controlled trials are done. They give a precise dose of psilocybin, for example, and they have you in a nice, quiet setting, and you're kind of counseled on what to experience and so on. And then they get feedback on your psychedelic experience, where they had mystical experience, etc., dissociation of your different senses, and so, which seems to be what's happening with these things. They kind of disconnect the sensory input to your brain from say, the prefrontal cortex that's involved in processing information going around in your brain. But anyway, good evidence for beneficial effects with depression, probably for anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, probably even for some beneficial effects for drug addiction. There's published papers with alcohol addiction. So we'll see what happens, but very exciting area, very exciting for brain research. I had three previous guests that talked about psychedelics. Franz Vollenweider, who was a very close friend and colleague of Albert Hoffman, who synthesized LSD and also synthesized psilocybin. So he talked about kind of the history, and he does a lot of brain imaging studies. David Nutt, I talked about on his talking about how, historically how bad it was that the government uh, made these psychedelics so illegal while making not illegal alcohol and less illegal, say, the opioids, which have caused much more damage. Well, it's dramatic. And Rob Malinka, who has this idea of disruptive psychopharmacology, that these chemicals, the psychedelics, maybe MDMA as well, they disrupt the neural networks and cause like a, in my view, kind of a stress response in a sense. In fact, BDNF levels go way up in the brain with these psychedelics. Uh, I'll remind you, BDNF levels go up with physical exercise. It has an antidepressant effect, anti-anxiety effect, maybe even anti-addictive effect. Um, and yeah, so maybe BDNF is a common explanation for brain health benefits of number of different environmental, lifestyle, and dietary factors. Okay, so BDNF, it activates receptors in the membrane, and these receptors are coupled to a cascade of enzymes that do a lot of good things for cells. They promote the growth of neurons, formation and maintenance of synapses, uh, neurogenesis, stress resistance. So really an important molecule. It's very important for learning and memory as well. Okay, and then, so that's the BDNF receptor, and this is the 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptamine is serotonin. And this 2A receptor is the one that it's thought the psychedelics act through. And it acts through the uh, through this pathway here, the MAP kinases, and they also through this pathway activate the PI3 kinase AKT and upregulate. So you get when you get this combination of upregulating BDNF through this pathway, then BDNF upregulating these beneficial pathways seems to do good things. Having said that, intuitively, it might not be good to have this excessively activated 24/7 because that can lead to, for example, aberrant growth of neurons and maybe some other problems in proliferation, hyperproliferation of cells, and maybe even, well, I don't know for sure. Okay, right. So the 5-HT2A receptors, there's this paper that came out a couple of years ago that attracted a lot of attention. And so they showed in culture neurons that psilocybin and DMT can promote the growth of dendrites of the neurons, that part of the neurons that receives information from from an axon from a connected cell. And they found that DMT and psilocybin increase the number of these dendritic spines, which are essentially synapses, postsynaptic sites. So it seems like in these culture neurons, you give them these psychedelics and they grow and form new synapses. Then the unusual thing, and I think that the reason this got published, because there had been some papers before suggesting these kinds of effects on neurons, was that in this paper they had evidence that these psychedelics are not acting on receptors exposed on the surface of the neurons, but get into the neurons. They go through the membranes. They're lipophilic, and they DMT and the psilocybin, they go through the membrane and then they interact with these serotonin receptors inside the neurons. And they didn't, from there on, they didn't really figure out exactly what happens here. And so this is, I don't want to say controversial, but very interesting, needs to be further explored there, whether they're acting in a different manner than, well, they are, I guess, than serotonin itself, right? I mean, they're causing hallucinations. And so I think that's a good point, you know. Serotonin is hydrophilic. It doesn't go through the membrane, whereas these do. And if you have these mechanisms going on inside the cell, that may explain why these induce hallucinations, but serotonin itself doesn't. Okay, this is my last slide. Okay, so I just wanted to point out this concept of hormesis, adaptive cellular stress responses. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. As long as what doesn't kill you, well, you know, the dose is important and the duration of exposure is important. So it's true for exercise. You can't run forever. If you do, you will die. Well, I guess that's an oxymoron. If you can't run forever if you die, you will run until you die. Um, Fasting, you can't fast forever. You're starved to death. Um, and then these plant chemicals that seem to be good for health, it's possible to overdose. But the reason we don't die from typically from over exerting ourselves physically, from fasting for relatively short time periods, or even longer time periods, a week or so, or eating these plants and mushrooms uh, is because we evolved. These are physiologically normal things that we evolved with, and individuals who functioned best in response to exercise, in response to food deprivation, in response to eating these noxious chemicals, those individuals survived and passed their genes on. So the individuals that were not adversely affected, they were better able to tolerate these stresses, uh, had gene mutations presumably that were beneficial. And then over periods of millions of years, we can now, today in modern societies, take advantage of this evolutionary history and subject ourselves to transient stressors, uh, throughout our daily, weekly routines and improve our general health and our brain health. Right. Okay. So anyway, yeah, this is a slide. This is from a long time ago, actually. Now, probably 2014, 15. This was my group in my lab at the National Institute on Aging Research Center, which is here in Baltimore on one of Johns Hopkins campuses. This is my running group, or the group that won the NIH relay. So we'd go running at noon during weekdays and then on trail runs on the weekend. A lot of nice hiking trails we'd run on around here. And then this is actually a long time ago. The faculty in the Department of Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins, where I'm an adjunct professor now. And geez, this department's grown a lot. I think this was probably 2004, maybe 20 years ago. Okay, so I'm getting old. I'm going to quit now with this podcast. And thank you for listening. And the reason I did this week is because my guest was sick. Uh, and so hopefully next week we'll be back on track, me talking to a guest, talking about some fascinating area of brain research and the latest of what's going on there. So thanks for your attention. Goodbye until next time.